These words from Stanley Milgram sound innocent, almost poetic, but behind them stands a man whose experiments revealed the darkest depths of human nature. After this video, you'll question your own moral boundaries because the disturbing truth is, under the right circumstances, you too could become the perpetrator. Imagine yourself in this scenario. You volunteered for what seems to be a simple scientific study on learning and memory. You're instructed to administer electric shocks to another participant whenever they make a mistake. With each error, you must increase the voltage. At first, it's just mild discomfort. But soon, the other person is screaming in pain, begging you to stop. Yet the researcher in the lab coat calmly tells you, the experiment requires that you continue. What would you do? Stop and walk away? Or continue pressing that button, delivering what you believe could be potentially fatal shocks to another human being? Most of us want to believe we'd refuse. We tell ourselves we would never harm an innocent person. But this comforting self-image is precisely what Milgram's infamous obedience experiments shattered. 65% of participants went all the way to the maximum 450-volt shock, a level marked XXX on the machine. That's the equivalent of inflicting potentially lethal harm on another person, simply because an authority figure told them to do so. This isn't just disturbing, it's terrifying, because it means that the capacity for evil lies dormant within ordinary people, including you. Why do conventional explanations for cruelty fail? Because they focus on the bad apples theory, the idea that only inherently evil people commit atrocities. They assume that Nazi officers, prison guards who torture, or soldiers who commit war crimes must be fundamentally different from normal people. But Milgram's research exposed this comforting fiction. The subjects weren't psychopaths or sadists. They were teachers, engineers, housewives, everyday people who thought of themselves as decent and moral. Have you ever felt that uncomfortable pressure to comply when someone in authority gives you instructions? That voice in your head that whispers, "Don't make waves," or "just follow the rules." Then you've already experienced the same psychological mechanism that can lead seemingly good people down the darkest of paths. Think about the last time you did something that made you uncomfortable simply because someone with authority asked you to do it. Perhaps a boss asked you to bend the truth to a client. Maybe a teacher insisted you follow a rule that seemed pointless or even harmful. These everyday moments of compliance are the seeds from which greater moral compromises grow. What you haven't seen yet is how understanding these mechanisms can actually liberate you. By confronting the shadow side of human nature, you gain power over it. As Carl Jung, the renowned psychologist, observed, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." And recent research confirms what Milgram discovered. These tendencies toward blind obedience are not fixed. They can be recognized, understood, and overcome. Psychologist Diana Baumrinn's work on ethical resistance shows that awareness of these mechanisms is the first step to developing immunity against dangerous compliance. The darkness only has power when it remains unexamined. Let's explore what Milgram's experiments actually revealed about the darker aspects of human nature. First and most disturbing is what psychologists now call the agentic shift, the moment when a person stops seeing themselves as an autonomous moral agent and becomes merely an instrument of someone else's will. When participants in Milgram's study were questioned afterward, they often said things like, "I was just following orders," or "the responsibility was his, not mine." This psychological mechanism doesn't just explain laboratory behavior. It's the same justification used by Nazi officers at the Nuremberg trials. Think about a time when you've surrendered your judgment to an authority figure, a boss, a doctor, a teacher. Was there a moment when you felt that uncomfortable shift from thinking independently to simply executing orders? This isn't a rare experience. It's woven into the fabric of daily life. Every time you silence your inner objections because that's just how things are done, you're experiencing a mini version of what happened in Milgram's lab. That moment when your inner voice grows quiet and you simply defer to external authority, that's the agentic shift happening in real time. Consider Sarah, a nurse who was instructed by a doctor to administer a medication at a dosage she suspected was dangerously high. Though her training told her to question the order, the hierarchy of the hospital made her hesitate. In that moment of doubt, she experienced the agentic shift, a temporary surrender of her own judgment to the authority of the physician. Fortunately, she found the courage to verify the dosage, discovering it was indeed 10 times higher than appropriate. Her story illustrates both the pull of obedience and the possibility of resistance. How many times have you been in Sarah's position, caught between your own judgment and the pressure to comply? The second insight reveals how proximity to suffering determines our willingness to inflict it. In variations of the experiment, Milgram found that the further removed participants were from their victims, the more likely they were to administer severe shocks. When they couldn't see or hear the person suffering, compliance rates soared to nearly 90%. But when required to physically force the victim's hand onto a shock plate, many refused. This distance effect explains how modern technology facilitates atrocities, from drone operators to corporate executives whose decisions harm people they'll never meet. Look at your own life. How many of your actions affect people you'll never see? When you buy products made by exploited workers or support policies that harm vulnerable groups you'll never meet, you're engaging in the same psychological distancing that enabled Milgram's subjects to inflict harm without feeling its full moral weight. That smartphone in your pocket, the clothes you're wearing, the food you eat, each of these connects you to complex webs of human labor and suffering that remain conveniently invisible. The distance between your consumer choices and their human consequences creates a moral buffer zone, not unlike the wall that separated Milgram's participants from their victims. This psychological distance isn't accidental. It's built into our economic and social systems. Companies deliberately obscure supply chains to prevent consumers from connecting their purchases with exploitation. Political rhetoric dehumanizes distant groups to make harmful policies more palatable. Media coverage sanitizes violence, keeping the blood and screams safely off-screen. Each of these mechanisms exploits the same psychological vulnerability Milgram identified: our reduced capacity for empathy when suffering is kept at arm's length. How different would your choices be if you had to look into the eyes of everyone affected by your decisions? The third revelation is perhaps the most chilling: the gradual nature of moral compromise. Participants didn't start by administering potentially lethal 450-volt shocks. They began with a harmless 15 volts, then increased in small increments. Each step seemed only slightly worse than the last, creating what psychologists call the slippery slope effect. By the time they reached dangerous levels, they'd already committed to the process, making it psychologically difficult to suddenly refuse. This same mechanism operates in your everyday life. Think about times you've compromised your values bit by bit, perhaps telling small lies that grew larger, overlooking minor ethical breaches that paved the way for bigger ones. The path to moral failure is rarely a dramatic leap. It's a series of small steps that seem innocuous in isolation. Remember the last time you found yourself doing something you once would have considered unthinkable? Chances are you didn't arrive there in one giant leap, but through a series of incremental compromises, each one only slightly more problematic than the last. Consider how corporate fraud typically evolves. Executives rarely begin with grand schemes to defraud shareholders. Instead, they start with creative accounting, minor manipulations to meet quarterly expectations. Each small deception makes the next one easier, until they find themselves engaged in massive financial crimes they never would have contemplated initially. This gradual erosion of boundaries is why ethical vigilance must be constant. The moment you dismiss a small transgression as not a big deal is precisely when the slippery slope begins. The fourth finding shows the power of unanimous consensus. When Milgram introduced Confederates who refused to continue, participants' compliance rates dropped dramatically. This demonstrates how crucial social support is for ethical resistance. Standing alone against authority requires extraordinary courage, but with even one ally, resistance becomes much more likely. Consider how this plays out in your life. How many times have you remained silent about something that bothered you because no one else was speaking up? The bystander effect, where everyone waits for someone else to act, creates the perfect conditions for moral abdication. Think about workplace meetings where questionable decisions go unchallenged, family gatherings where harmful comments pass without objection, or social situations where inappropriate behavior continues because no one wants to be the first to object. Each of these represents a microcosm of Milgram's laboratory, where the absence of dissent becomes implicit permission for harm. This insight offers a powerful lesson. Your voice matters more than you realize. When you speak up, you don't just express your own values. You create permission for others to find their courage. Consider whistleblowers who have exposed corporate malfeasance or government corruption. Their initial stand often inspires others to come forward, creating a cascade of resistance that can topple even the most entrenched systems of abuse. Never underestimate how your willingness to be the first dissenting voice can transform an entire social dynamic. The fifth insight reveals that our susceptibility to authority is deeply influenced by contextual cues. When the experiment moved from Yale University to a less prestigious location, compliance dropped. When the researcher wore casual clothes instead of a lab coat, fewer people obeyed. These subtle environmental signals shape our judgment about who deserves our compliance. Look around at how you respond differently to the same request, depending on who makes it and how they're dressed. The doctor in a white coat, the officer in uniform, the executive in a suit. These visual signals bypass our rational faculties and trigger automatic deference. Being aware of these triggers is the first step toward reclaiming your moral autonomy. Notice how your posture changes, how your voice shifts, how your critical thinking often shuts down in the presence of these symbols of authority. This awareness itself becomes a form of resistance. These context effects explain why institutions invest so heavily in symbols of authority. Impressive buildings, formal titles, distinctive uniforms, elaborate ceremonies. Each element creates a psychological environment that enhances compliance. Military organizations understand this perfectly, using ranks, uniforms, and ritualized interactions to establish clear authority relationships. Corporate environments employ similar tactics with corner offices, executive titles, and dress codes that visually reinforce hierarchy. Even academic institutions rely on campus architecture, ceremonial regalia, and formal credentials to augment their authority. Recognizing these deliberate environmental cues helps you see through their psychological impact. It's important to address the ethical issues surrounding Milgram's research itself. Today, his experiments would never receive approval from an ethics committee. Participants experienced significant psychological distress, even trauma, believing they had harmed or potentially killed another person. Many were visibly shaking, sweating, or having nervous laughs during the procedure. The deception involved the learner was actually an actor who wasn't receiving shocks, violated principles of informed consent that are now fundamental to research ethics. Yet despite these problems, the knowledge gained has proven invaluable. Milgram's findings have informed everything from military training to corporate ethics programs. They've helped explain historical atrocities and prevent future ones. The ethical question becomes, was the temporary distress of participants justified by the broader understanding of human behavior that resulted? This highlights the delicate balance between scientific knowledge and human dignity. Milgram's experiments themselves reveal a painful irony. His pursuit of understanding the psychology of harmful obedience led him to create situations that caused psychological harm through obedience. Some participants reported nightmares, anxiety, and guilt that persisted long after the experiments concluded. One man wrote to Milgram years later, still troubled by his own capacity for cruelty. This ethical complexity forces us to confront difficult questions. How do we balance the pursuit of knowledge against the well-being of individuals? When does the end justify the means? These questions have no simple answers, but they demand our thoughtful engagement. This research has profound contemporary relevance. Today's digital environment creates unprecedented distance between our actions and their consequences. When you share misleading information online, participate in cyberbullying, or support dehumanizing rhetoric about groups you perceive as other, you're engaging with the same psychological mechanisms Milgram uncovered. Modern technology has created new versions of the shock machine, with the suffering of victims often completely invisible to those causing harm. Consider how social media platforms are designed to exploit our psychological vulnerabilities. Algorithms push increasingly extreme content, creating a digital version of Milgram's incremental shock increases. Corporate surveillance represents a new form of authority, with tech companies as the researchers in white coats directing our behavior. Understanding these parallels helps you recognize when your autonomy is being compromised. The modern workplace often functions as a laboratory for obedience. Corporate hierarchies, performance metrics, and team dynamics can create environments where ethical concerns are suppressed in favor of compliance with authority. Whistleblowers repeatedly describe being pressured to overlook safety violations, financial improprieties, or harmful practices for the good of the company. Their stories echo Milgram's participants, caught between their conscience and the authority structure demanding their compliance. By recognizing these parallels, you can identify situations where your workplace might be asking you to compromise your values incrementally. So how can you apply these insights to protect yourself from becoming an unwitting participant in harm? First, develop awareness of situational influences. Pay attention to moments when you feel pressure to comply with requests that make you uncomfortable. Notice when you're being gradually led down a path of increasing moral compromise. These awareness moments are your first line of defense. Practice recognizing the physical sensations that accompany moral discomfort. The tightness in your chest, the knot in your stomach, the tension in your shoulders. These bodily signals often register ethical concerns before your conscious mind has fully articulated them. Learn to pause when you experience these sensations, creating space to reconnect with your values before automatically complying. This mind-body awareness becomes a powerful tool for ethical resistance in high-pressure situations. Second, cultivate ethical pre-commitment. Before entering situations with authority pressure, consciously establish your moral boundaries. Research shows that people who have thought through ethical dilemmas in advance are much more likely to resist harmful instructions. Ask yourself, what orders would I refuse, no matter who gave them? Where exactly is my line? Write these boundaries down, making your commitment concrete rather than abstract. Some professionals even develop personal ethical codes that clarify their non-negotiable values before they face difficult situations. Third, seek allies and support systems. Remember how dramatically compliance dropped when participants saw others refuse? Build relationships with people who share your ethical values and can provide social support for resistance. Create environments where questioning authority is not just permitted, but encouraged. Identify potential allies in your workplace, community, or social circles. People you can turn to when facing ethical pressure. Having even one person who will support your moral stance can make the difference between compliance and resistance. Fourth, practice small acts of resistance. Moral courage, like any skill, improves with practice. Start by speaking up about minor concerns. Each time you successfully assert your ethical boundaries, you strengthen your capacity to resist in more consequential situations. Look for low-stakes opportunities to exercise your moral voice, perhaps questioning an unnecessarily harsh policy at work, challenging a biased comment in conversation, or refusing to participate in gossip that demeans others. These small moments of integrity build your ethical muscles for larger challenges. Fifth, recognize the warning signs of an agentic shift. When you catch yourself thinking, "I was just doing what I was told," or "that's not my responsibility," pause and reclaim your moral agency. Remember that following orders does not absolve you of ethical responsibility, a principle established at Nuremberg and reaffirmed by Milgram's research. Practice using language that acknowledges your moral autonomy. "I choose to," instead of "I have to," or "they make me." This linguistic shift reinforces your agency in situations where external pressure is strong. What does all this mean for our understanding of human nature and free will? Milgram's experiments force us to confront unsettling questions about moral autonomy. If ordinary people can so easily be led to harm others, what does this say about our capacity for ethical self-determination? Are we truly free moral agents, or merely products of social circumstances and authority structures? This brings us to the existential dimension of Milgram's work. Philosophers like Jean-Paul Sartre would argue that the participants who continued administering shocks were exhibiting bad faith, denying their fundamental freedom to choose. By attributing their actions to external authority, they were avoiding the heavy responsibility that comes with acknowledging their freedom. In Sartre's words, they were condemned to be free, but unwilling to bear the weight of that freedom. Yet in this seemingly dark conclusion lies a path to liberation. By recognizing how easily we can be manipulated, we gain the awareness necessary to reclaim our moral agency. Understanding our vulnerability is the first step toward overcoming it. As Milgram himself wrote, "Ordinary people, simply doing their jobs and without any particular hostility on their part, can become agents in a terrible destructive process." The existential question at the heart of Milgram's work isn't just about obedience. It's about the nature of human identity itself. Are we defined by our social roles and hierarchical positions, or by our capacity for autonomous moral choice? When participants surrendered their judgment to the experimenter, they temporarily surrendered something essential about their humanity: their responsibility to choose and to bear the consequences of those choices. This abdication of moral selfhood represents a profound form of existential evasion, a refusal to confront the burden and glory of human freedom. Consider how this existential dimension manifests in your own life. How often do you define yourself primarily through social roles, employee, citizen, family member, rather than as a free moral agent? When do you find yourself seeking refuge in conformity rather than embracing the anxiety of authentic choice? These questions aren't merely philosophical abstractions, they touch the core of how you experience your own existence. Milgram's experiments reveal that our default mode is often to surrender our freedom rather than exercise it, a revelation that calls us to greater consciousness about the choices we make and avoid making every day. Tom, the teacher who participated in Milgram's original experiment, initially went all the way to the maximum shock level. Afterward, he was devastated by what he had done. But unlike many participants who sought to justify their actions, Tom used the experience as a catalyst for profound self-examination. He later became an ethics teacher, sharing his story with students to help them understand how easily moral judgment can be compromised. His experience of moral failure became the foundation for a lifetime of ethical vigilance, both for himself and for others. Tom's story illustrates a paradoxical truth. Sometimes our darkest moments can become the source of our greatest moral growth. His confrontation with his own capacity for cruelty didn't destroy him, it transformed him. By facing his shadow, he discovered a deeper commitment to ethical living than he had ever known before. His journey from complicity to moral leadership offers hope that confronting our own darkness can lead not to despair but to authentic ethical awakening. Contrast Tom's response with that of another participant, William, who insisted even years later that he had done nothing wrong. The experimenter said he would take responsibility, so none of it was on me, William maintained. This denial of personal agency protected him from the painful self-recognition that Tom experienced, but it also prevented any moral growth. William remained vulnerable to the same psychological mechanisms that had led him to harm another person, while Tom developed a heightened resistance to harmful authority. Their divergent paths show that what matters isn't just what we do under pressure, but how we integrate those actions into our understanding of ourselves afterward. So what have we learned? The capacity for harm lies within all of us, activated not by inherent evil, but by specific situational forces. Authority, gradual escalation, distance from victims, lack of allies, and environmental cues can transform ordinary people into agents of cruelty. But knowledge of these mechanisms gives us power to resist them. Would you have pushed that button? The uncomfortable truth is that statistically, you probably would have. just like 2/3 of Milgram's participants. But now that you understand the psychological traps that enable such behavior, you have a chance to be among the 1/3 who refuse. Your awareness is your power. I want you to try something today. Pay attention to 3 situations where you feel pressure to comply with requests that make you uncomfortable. Notice the physical sensations in your body, the thoughts that arise, and the social dynamics at play. Don't judge yourself. Just observe with curiosity. This simple practice of mindful awareness is your first step toward ethical autonomy. This exercise isn't just abstract philosophical reflection, it's practical training in moral resistance. By developing your capacity to notice compliance pressure in real time, you're strengthening the neural pathways that support ethical decision-making under stress. Research in neuroplasticity suggests that this kind of mindful attention actually changes your brain, making ethical awareness more accessible in future challenging situations. Think of it as mental preparation for moments when your moral courage will be tested more severely. What experiences have you had where you felt pressured to comply with something that went against your values? Have you ever witnessed someone else's remarkable moral courage in standing up to authority? Share your stories in the comments below. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear to find their own courage. Remember, understanding the darkness within human nature isn't about condemning ourselves or others. It's about bringing light to those shadows so they lose their power over us. As Maya Angelou wisely said, "History, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, need not be lived again." The legacy of Milgram's work isn't just scientific, it's deeply personal for each of us. His experiments hold up a mirror that reflects not just what we are, but what we might become. They challenge us to live with greater moral awareness, to cultivate the courage to resist harmful authority, and to create communities that support ethical resistance rather than blind compliance. In a world increasingly shaped by invisible authorities and distant consequences, this legacy has never been more relevant or more urgent. The button is before you. What will you choose?